Jim Potts was a man known for service and integrity. A 51-year-old private investigator from Wyandotte, Oklahoma, he had built a career on public trust. His professional history included time as a firefighter for the city of Joplin, Missouri, and years of military service in the U.S. Army, with deployments in Germany and Bosnia. Later, Potts served in law enforcement and then as a legal investigator for the Loring and Wyant law firm. Throughout these roles, he developed a reputation for diligence, fairness, and a deep commitment to accountability. In the summer of 2003, he accepted an assignment that would place him at the center of a controversial investigation involving the Galena Police Department in southeastern Kansas. By August 26 of that same year, he would be found dead under circumstances that, more than 2 decades later, still generate questions and suspicion. At the time of his death, Jim Potts was investigating allegations of misconduct and brutality within the Galena Police Department. His work had been commissioned by attorney Roger Johnson of Joplin, Missouri, who had hired Potts to look into a case involving a man named Alberto Reyes. Reyes had allegedly suffered a broken arm during an encounter with Galena police, and Potts was tasked with determining whether excessive force had been used. As he pursued this line of inquiry, Potts expanded his scope. He interviewed residents, former city officials, and others with knowledge of the department's operations. He was actively gathering statements and documentation regarding a pattern of behavior that included not just the Reyes incident but also other accusations of civil rights violations and internal misconduct under then Police Chief Cameron Arthur. Potts took his investigation seriously. He applied for a Kansas private investigator license to legitimize his growing caseload in the state. He met with officials, including Galena City Commissioner Darrell Shoemaker and former Commissioner George Jackson. He made it known that he was building a case, one that he intended to bring to public attention if necessary. He also spoke to his wife, Carolyn Potts, about his work. According to her later statements, he told her directly, "If anything happens to me, I want you to look at the Galena Police Department." She said he repeated that warning with urgency, adding, "If you delve into it, if you ask too many questions, you're next." That conversation occurred a few weeks before his death. On the morning of August 26, 2003, at approximately 6:11 a.m., Jim Potts was found dead beside his car, a silver gray 1985 Buick LeSabre, which was parked along the southbound shoulder of Kansas Highway 26. The vehicle's engine was running, and the headlights were on. Potts' body was discovered lying on the gravel near the rear passenger side tire. A black .38 caliber revolver was found near his right foot. His Oklahoma driver's license was located upside down near his left hand. He had been shot in the head. The official autopsy revealed a gunshot entry wound behind and below the right ear, with the bullet exiting through the left temple. Despite the unusual nature of the entry wound and the absence of a suicide note, the Cherokee County Sheriff's Department quickly ruled the death a suicide and closed the case within hours. Several aspects of the investigation immediately drew concern from the Potts family and those familiar with standard investigative procedures. The lead investigator for the Cherokee County Sheriff's Department, Deputy Sean Putnam, was also working part-time for the Galena Police Department. This dual employment presented an apparent conflict of interest. The department Potts had been investigating was the same one that employed the man assigned to determine the cause of his death. The revolver found at the scene was never tested for fingerprints or DNA. No gunshot residue test was conducted on Potts' hands. The bullet that caused his death was never recovered, despite a precise entry and exit point that should have narrowed the search. The gun itself, later identified as being registered to the San Angelo Police Department in Texas, was not entered into evidence, and no explanation was offered for how it arrived at the scene. In the months following Jim Potts' death, his wife Carolyn embarked on a campaign to secure answers. She contacted elected officials, law enforcement oversight bodies, and journalists. One of her appeals reached former U.S. Representative Brad Carson, who contacted the U.S. Department of Justice on her behalf. In March 2005, the department confirmed in writing that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had been asked to conduct a preliminary review into the matter. The letter, signed by Bobby Bernstein from the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, stated that if any prosecutable violation of federal criminal civil rights law were found, appropriate action would be taken. However, no further public action from the FBI followed. The Joplin Globe, the local newspaper, began conducting its investigation into the case. Reporters uncovered discrepancies and procedural gaps in the official handling of Potts' death. In June 2004, the newspaper published a detailed analysis of the crime scene and the autopsy based on materials obtained from the sheriff's office. They also consulted 4 independent forensic experts, 2 pathologists, and 2 criminologists, to evaluate the validity of the suicide ruling. The experts' findings cast serious doubt on the official version of events. The first significant issue identified by the experts was the positioning and type of the gunshot wound. The bullet had entered from behind and below the right ear and exited through the left temple. According to the experts, this was an unusual trajectory for a self-inflicted wound. In their professional experience, individuals committing suicide by firearm rarely choose this angle, as it is difficult to reach and requires an awkward hand position. One expert conducted tests simulating the shot and concluded that the necessary grip and motion made it highly improbable that the wound was self-inflicted. Another point of concern was the blood spatter evidence. Photographs from the autopsy and scene revealed blood on Potts' left arm. For this to occur, his arm would have needed to be elevated near his head at the time of the shooting. This detail raised questions about his posture at the moment of death and whether his body could have assumed that position naturally. Additionally, blood was found on the palm of Potts' right hand. If he had fired the gun with that hand, it would not have come into contact with blood in that way unless it had happened after death, possibly through movement or staging. Perhaps most damning was the ammunition used in the revolver. The weapon was loaded with hollow point bullets, which are designed to expand on impact and typically do not exit the body. Yet Potts had not 1 but 2 exit wounds. The experts found this highly inconsistent with the type of ammunition and the expected ballistic behavior. This discrepancy raised the possibility that a different firearm had been used or that the scene had been manipulated in some way to fit a specific narrative. The culmination of these issues led the experts to one conclusion. While none could definitively say Potts was murdered, they unanimously agreed that the evidence did not support a suicide. One of the experts, Wayne Hill Sr., a firearms and ballistics consultant, stated plainly, "I don't think he shot himself." Hill and others called for a complete and impartial investigation by a qualified authority. They emphasized that any competent forensic team would have recognized the inconsistencies and reopened the case. As public awareness of the case grew, Cherokee County officials faced increased pressure. Sheriff Bob Creech initially dismissed the renewed attention, telling reporters that media coverage had created a frenzy. However, he eventually asked the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, KBI, to conduct a fresh review. KBI agent Bill Delaney confirmed in mid-2004 that the agency was beginning a review of the case. He offered no timeline for completion and indicated that the review would include the sheriff's original findings, witness interviews, and new forensic evaluations if warranted. At the same time, a grand jury was convened in Cherokee County to consider the facts surrounding Jim Potts' death. The jury met in 2005 on at least 8 occasions. According to reports, no indictments were issued, and there was little public explanation of the process. Some observers speculated that the jury may not have received all available evidence or that the way the material was presented influenced their conclusions. The Potts family, as well as attorney Roger Johnson, continued to express frustration with the lack of transparency. Carolyn Potts remained at the center of the effort for answers. She maintained that her husband was not suicidal and pointed to his recent activity as evidence. He had been remodeling their home, spending time with his children, and was deeply engaged in his work. He had never exhibited signs of depression or despair. On the contrary, he was making plans for the future. The conversation in which he warned her to be cautious if anything happened to him was one of the most chilling pieces of circumstantial evidence. Combined with the forensic contradictions and investigative mishandling, she believed it strongly suggested foul play. In addition to the inconsistencies in the autopsy and scene investigation, there were troubling questions about the chain of custody regarding the weapon found at the scene. The revolver had not been adequately entered into evidence and was reportedly returned to its source, the San Angelo Police Department in Texas. No explanation was ever provided as to how a department-issued firearm from another state ended up at the scene of a suspected suicide in Kansas. No report of the weapon being stolen or missing was made public. This untraceable connection added another layer of mystery to an already complex case. As the first part of this narrative ends, Jim Potts' story stands at the intersection of official silence and public skepticism. A respected investigator was found dead while investigating allegations of police brutality. The circumstances surrounding his death were suspicious, and the response by local authorities was, by all available accounts, inadequate. Although the Kansas Bureau of Investigation and the FBI both reviewed the case, neither pursued it beyond a preliminary phase. The grand jury issued no charges. To this day, The official ruling remains suicide despite the significant forensic and procedural inconsistencies that suggest the truth may be far more troubling. The death of Jim Potts did not fade quietly. From the moment it was discovered, the events surrounding his passing stirred concern, and the manner in which the investigation was conducted only deepened that concern. His family, particularly his widow Carolyn, stood firm in their belief that the ruling of suicide did not align with the man they knew or with the evidence that existed. For them, and for many who followed the case, the death of Jim Potts represented more than personal tragedy. It was a warning about what could happen when the power goes unchecked, when systems fail to scrutinize themselves, and when those who question authority are met with silence instead of answers. As the public learned more through the Joplin Globe's detailed investigative reporting, the picture of Potts' final weeks grew clearer. He was not a man disengaged from life. He was remodeling his home. He was planning for new work opportunities. He was deeply involved in his role as a private investigator and had just begun to uncover what he believed to be serious misconduct in the Galena Police Department. This department, led at the time by Chief Cameron Arthur, had already been the subject of complaints from residents who alleged abuse, excessive force, and unprofessional behavior. Potts' investigation was focused initially on a single case, the broken arm suffered by Alberto Reyes during an arrest. Still, it had since expanded based on interviews he conducted and evidence he gathered. Potts had built a timeline, spoken to former city officials, and was reportedly assembling a formal case that would not only expose specific actions by officers but possibly implicate the department in patterns of abuse. He was contacting witnesses and gathering written statements. He had also filed the necessary paperwork to become a licensed private investigator in the state of Kansas, signaling his intent to continue and broaden his work. According to friends and family, Potts believed that the misconduct in Galena was more than isolated. He thought it was systemic, and while he approached his investigation with the measured discipline of a professional, those close to him said he was aware that his presence in Galena had stirred discomfort and tension among certain officers and officials. The investigative failures in Potts' death were not small errors or minor oversights. They were foundational flaws in the handling of a potentially criminal case. A revolver found at the scene was never processed for fingerprints or DNA. The bullet that ended Potts' life was never recovered, even though it passed through his head and exited the body, which would generally make it retrievable in a controlled scene. The gun was a registered service weapon from the San Angelo Police Department in Texas. No records explained how that firearm traveled from a municipal department in Texas to a Kansas roadside. The gun was not cataloged as evidence and was instead reportedly returned without a proper forensic review. Basic steps, such as bagging the hands for residue testing, were not taken. No attempt was made to document the trajectory of the bullet using scene measurements or diagrams. Interviews with close contacts who might have known about Potts' recent activities were either not conducted or not included in the case file. 2 witnesses who lived near the location where Potts' body was found later told the Joplin Globe that the timeline offered by the Cherokee County Sheriff's Department did not match what they saw or heard that morning. This meant that even the most basic facts of the case, time of death, positioning of the body, and sequence of discovery, were open to serious doubt. The Cherokee County Sheriff at the time, Bob Creech, initially resisted calls to reopen the case. He later admitted to reporters that the attention being drawn by the press had created what he called a frenzy, but said he wanted to ensure public confidence. This led to his request for the Kansas Bureau of Investigation to step in. The KBI review, announced in mid-2004, was vague in scope. Special Agent Bill Delaney said the agency had just begun its work and offered no timeline or detail. The public would later learn that the KBI did conduct a review of the materials provided by the sheriff's office and re-interviewed some individuals. Still, it ultimately concluded that there was no credible evidence of homicide. That conclusion, however, did little to satisfy the family or independent experts. In 2005, mounting public pressure resulted in a grand jury being convened in Cherokee County to examine the circumstances of Potts' death. Grand juries are rare in Kansas, but the nature of this case and the growing number of questions made the step necessary. The jury met on at least 8 separate occasions. It heard testimony, reviewed documents, and considered evidence. Yet, at the end of its work, it returned no indictments and released no explanation for its decision. The secrecy surrounding grand jury proceedings meant that no one outside the process knew what had been submitted, what was left out, or how the material had been framed. Attorney Roger Johnson, who had hired Potts and was a key figure in pushing for a deeper investigation, expressed serious concerns. He questioned whether the jury had been shown all the forensic evidence. He doubted they had reviewed the expert analyses from the ballistics consultant and pathologists. He feared that the jury had been presented with a carefully controlled version of events designed to reinforce the original ruling rather than to question it. Carolyn Potts agreed. For both of them, the grand jury marked another institutional failure to confront uncomfortable facts. One of the lasting questions about Jim Potts' death revolves around the revolver itself. As mentioned previously, the weapon was traced to the San Angelo Police Department. It was never made public whether the gun had been reported stolen if it had been in active use, or how it left official control. If it had been planted, the investigation did not uncover how that occurred. If it had been lawfully transferred and ended up at the scene through coincidence, that information was never shared. The origin and handling of the firearm remain one of the case's most unsettling unknowns. The forensic experts who analyzed the scene and autopsy photos pointed out several anomalies. The angle of the gunshot, the type of ammunition, the presence of blood on Potts' right palm, and the blood spatter on his left arm all contradicted the official narrative. The fact that hollow point bullets were in the revolver made the two exit wounds statistically rare. The blood on the right hand should not have been there if he had fired the weapon himself. The raised position of his left arm suggested a defensive posture, not a suicidal act. These experts did not all agree on what happened, but they all agreed on what did not happen. None of them supported the ruling of suicide. Despite the compelling nature of these facts, no state or federal agency moved beyond preliminary reviews. The FBI confirmed in 2005 that it had begun a review in response to a letter from U.S. Representative Brad Carson, who had acted after being contacted by Carolyn Potts. The Justice Department, in a formal letter to Carson, stated that the FBI had been asked to look into whether there had been any violations of federal civil rights statutes. That investigation, like others, led to no formal findings, no charges, and no public report. The case once again returned to a state of quiet dismissal. By 2007, the Kansas Attorney General's office sent a letter to the Potts family indicating that no new evidence had emerged and that the official cause of death would remain unchanged. That letter effectively closed the book for the state. But for Carolyn and those who knew Jim, the matter remained painfully unresolved. He had been a man of discipline and dedication, someone who approached his work with seriousness and compassion. He was a father, a husband, and a veteran. He had survived deployments in foreign countries and devoted himself to public service only to die in a gravel ditch in his backyard, without justice or accountability. The Galena Police Department, which had been the focus of Potts' final investigation, underwent its transformation in the aftermath. Police Chief Cameron Arthur was removed from his position in late 2003, just months after Potts' death. His removal was attributed to a series of unrelated controversies, including internal misconduct and public complaints. No charges were filed against Arthur in relation to Potts or the Reyes investigation. The department was restructured, and over time, public attention shifted to other matters. But the shadow of the case remained, especially for those who felt that Potts had been silenced rather than listened to. Jim Potts was laid to rest in GAR Cemetery near Miami, Oklahoma. His grave is simple, marked with the symbols of his service. There is no mention of how he died, yet, for many in the region, his name is remembered as more than a footnote. It is a symbol of the dangers faced by those who challenge entrenched power. It is a reminder of what can happen when investigative systems fail to uphold their most basic responsibilities. And it is a warning to future investigators, reporters, and citizens that the truth is not always protected by the people meant to uncover it. To this day, Jim Potts' case has not been reopened. There has been no new forensic review. The bullet that killed him was never recovered. The firearm that ended his life was never explained. The motive, if there was one, was never investigated with transparency. And the man who raised questions about police brutality in a small Kansas town was left without the answers he sought. Those who believe in justice still ask what happened to Jim Potts. They still raise his name when conversations turn to accountability and the limits of local power. And they still wait for someone in authority to reopen a file that, despite its official closure, has never truly been settled.